Okay, hello everyone. So as people are slowly joining us in, I will begin my introduction. So we are really grateful that you could all join us today, especially during these unprecedented times, for what we hope to be a very timely, engaging, and thought-provoking couple of days. So my name is Michal, and together with my colleagues Konstantinos and Alex, we are honored to be hosting this virtual conference in association with the Mattern Center for Architectural and Urban Studies and the Center for Research in the Arts, Social Sciences and Humanities at the University of Cambridge. From the outset, that this was intended to be a physical conference, but the recent pandemic led us to turn it into a virtual event. And we strongly feel that during a time of enforced distance, mass protests for social justice, it seems important to carve out some space, even virtually, for collective reflection on the commons. And by commons, we refer not only to the natural environment and its resources, but also to shared social creation that result from human labor, such as public space, information, culture, ideas, and new technologies and cyberspaces. Importantly, we envision commoning as an ongoing collective practice and ethics that does not merely concern the end, but also a means, a process. This virtual conference will inquire into the relevance of the commons in an age of digital transformation, mounting inequalities, institutional violence, and a global pandemic. We ask whether this new reality can become the basis for new practices of commoning, from the socialization of goods, healthcare, and digital content to radical forms of collaboration, collective care, and community solidarity. And I will now hand it over to Konstantinos, my colleague.
Hi, everyone. I am Konstantinos, and we will start the day with the panel Commoning the City. This panel will explore the current potentialities and constraints of the production of the city as a common space. It seeks to unpack ways in which physical spaces can become common against the backdrop of privatization, the market imperative of global capitalism, and the proliferation of virtual spaces. Can the demand for universal access to common resources and urban infrastructures become the basis for a new urban commons? And how can new emerging urban social movements practice the commons today in a globalized and translocal context? To address these questions and many others, we're honored to have with us today some of the leading voices in academia and beyond. Our distinguished guests are thinkers and practitioners. They're multiple award recipients, and they have written extensively on the politics of urban infrastructure and on current forms of constructing, reclaiming, and sharing the urban commons. I will now present the speakers, and they will then deliver their presentations alphabetically. Amin is a professor of philosophy at Cambridge University, and his recent books include Land of Strangers, Releasing the Commons, co-edited with Philip Howell, and Seeing Like a City, co-authored with Nigel Thrift. He's currently working on poverty, mental states, and spatial subjectivity in Shanghai and Delhi. Massimo de Angelis is a professor of political economy and social change at the University of East London. He has been writing extensively about enclosures and commons in a context of contemporary capitalism since the late 90s, and his latest book is Omnia Sunt Communia on the Commons and Post-Capitalist Transformation, published with Z. Shannon Mattern is a professor of anthropology at the New School, and she has written numerous books, articles, chapters about archives, libraries, maps, as well as urban infrastructures and smart cities. She contributes a regular column about urban data and mediated spaces to the journal Places. Finally, we have Richard Sennett with us, who currently serves as a senior advisor to the United Nations on its program on climate change and cities. He's a senior fellow at the Center on Capitalism and Society at Columbia University, and he's a visiting professor of urban studies at MIT. His books include The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, the corrosion of character, the culture of the new capitalism, and building and dwelling. And now I would like to invite Amin to begin with his presentation.
Okay, let me jump straight in then with a generalization. Seems to me that there's very little doubt from a mounting body of evidence concerning the steady erasure of the urban commons all over the world through land grabs, the surveillance and restriction of public space, the monetization of services and welfare, and elite capture by government, including of territory, or the elite capture of government. Here, think alone of the wonderful work of Brett Christophers and Saskia Sassen on land grabs. And if you add the other research, it tells a tale of the corrosive erosion of public space, of public goods, and public culture, very much to the detriment of urban majorities and also the ethos of collective life. But this is not a totalizing trend. Despite the corporatization of or privatization of the commons in different cities, it's my firm belief that they remain places of public encounter and service, of grassroots occupancy and claim. And in many ways, the actual ontology of the urban, its variegated, complex, out of reach nature, I think makes for repositories of all kinds of collective practice. Oddly enough, are becoming increasingly visible, not invisible, in our necropolitical times. So, the examples here are of community ventures, the sociality of strangers, social enterprise sharing, the circular economy, vernacular build, cooperative practice. So I think optimistically we can say that the catalogue of and around the urban commons is far from empty, though maybe in our authoritarian age it is becoming slightly more subaltern, slightly more fugitive. This is partly why in our book, Reclaiming the Commons, Philip Howell and I very much laid the stress on the verb and not the noun, on commoning practices and endeavors under the radar of, let us call them, the encroachers, so as to acknowledge the many ways in which groups and neighborhoods coalesce around joint effort. So here, if the notion of the general will doesn't quite capture the effort, I think that of social making and doing, as Richard Sennett has written, and also the notion of spatial surplus gets a lot closer. So in my few minutes, what I want to do is I want to dwell on the example of the notion of spatial surplus, the meaning of which will become clear in a minute, where the social occupancy of urban space generates a temporary commons. I'm not thinking of the likes of Occupy or the Arab Spring, which produced a very powerful counterculture, but also crushing reactions from the authorities. But I'm thinking here rather of the prosaic presence in unclaimed or semi-claimed land of the poor, where publicness, depending on whether public services are available, turns out to be quite important for survival. But my argument I want to make is that it does so in always very contingent and fragile ways, never far from becoming either menacing or against the interests of the occupants, the poor in this case. And perhaps I can provide an illustration from my new work on two poor areas in Delhi. One is an established slum in prosperous South Delhi, and the other a bankside of the Yamuna River in Old Delhi, with the homeless shelter under flimsy tents on open ground. Now, if I was technologically more capable, I would have shown you some really fantastic pictures of both places, but since I'm incompetent, I won't. So I returned from a field visit in late January from Delhi, looking at the mental states of the poor in these settlements in the face of poverty, risk, and insecurity. Of course, looking back now from today's perspective, who knows how much worse the situation has become in both spaces under a politics of lockdown, which has no care whatsoever towards Indian migrants and indeed the Indian majority, which happens to be poor. So coming back to my study, the aim of the study was to look at how dwelling practices, the interactions of body and environment, the practices of situated living, intervene in the negotiation of existential and mental challenges. How the dynamics of public space intervene in the balances of social endurance and fragility was one of our questions during the ethnography. So in the case of the working slum, it happens to be called Kusumpur Pahari in South Delhi. In this working slum, which bears the marks of 40 years of vernacular home building and neighborhood servicing, eventually then replaced by provisions from the state, the spillover of people and things from cramped houses and narrow alleyways into public spaces, surplus space if you want, into the slum's main streets, its roadside openings, its open spaces, a place called the Maidan, and around its sanitation blocks, has acquired an affirmative dimension. In the mingling of the private and public on familiar and facilitative ground, I saw there arises a kind of spatial affordance. I found that the fleeting street conversations, the games on the Maidan, gossip on the charpoys, these are beds which are put out on the street for people to sit on, the calling out to neighbors from roof terraces, and the coming together, especially of women around water tankers, help residents to find a kind of distraction from their daily anxieties. It allows them to share information, to exchange favors, to learn about opportunities. Of course, none of this is guaranteed, especially for those with the most troubled minds and the most troubled lives. But the chance to be distracted, to connect, and to feel part of a wider entity is there to be taken. Let's put it that way. Importantly, the spaces are also sites of collective knowledge formation. I was struck by the breadth and clarity of view from all kinds of residents, young and old, on the slums, on the nature of the slum's predicaments and what was needed to improve life in the slum. I was also struck by the clarity of view on how the lives and mental states of residents could be improved. I felt, interestingly enough, that much of this vernacular intelligence aroused from the possibility of encounter in densely occupied landscape. So if in the slum there's a kind of reciprocity between public spillover and private well-being, exactly the opposite is true in the makeshift occupation of the banks of the Yamuna by the homeless. Here, the dynamic of commoning has only a residual quality, partly because the habitat is rudimentary, partly because the individuals are desperate, and partly because welfare provisions and work opportunities are meager. Where I was, the site that I chose, below a narrow upper level on which there were some NGO shelters providing temporary accommodation and services and food to only some of the homeless, there was, stretching down to the river, an area of bare ground, rubbish heaps, a huge water pipeline, and trees scattered with cloth and plastic tents, plus, interestingly enough, 2 makeshift cinemas and a shop and a tea stall. In this difficult to interpret landscape, camp out the homeless. If not lucky enough to be out for the day at work, wandering around wrapped in blankets, huddled around fires, playing a small fee to watch movies, essentially to keep warm in the winter months, passing the time of day playing cards or Ludo, plying drinks and drugs to find some relief from their dire daily circumstances. These largely single male migrants are physically and mentally stretched, no doubt about that, afflicted by substance addiction, physical impairment, or mental disorders, trying their very best to find work as unskilled day laborers, pushing carts or washing up at wedding parties to meet ends meet. Most of these individuals tend to find 3, 4, 5 days of work in a month. So they are truly poor. They need help and support. Now, interestingly, this co-occupied habitat, in contrast to the slum that I mentioned before, makes only for bare and isolated existence. Its meager tea stalls and cinemas, its acrid fires and fleeting conversations provide only temporary respite. Here, there are very few affordances of place, and the homeless are reduced to relying on their inner reserve that they barely possess. Their prospects hang in the balance between finding work, maintaining a grip on their own lives, and the serendipity of care coming their way from the likes of NGOs. Interestingly, here along the Yamuna banks, place does not take up any of the slack, and if anything, adds to the difficulties of the homeless through its bleak and monotonous landscape, its absent infrastructures and services, its flimsy shacks, its encounters without tangible rewards. The gossip doesn't lead to very much, you might say. Its menacing and unpredictable atmosphere, especially as night descends and out come the marijuana and the drink. So in this instance, spatial surplus, if this is the right term, this pouring out of people into a space that is never fully claimed by anyone, so it's a surplus space. Here, spatial surplus offers very little respite for subjects facing the same extreme hardships. So to come to a conclusion, I'm still very much working my way through the implications of these differences in the tonalities of the occupied ground. Certainly they speak to how much more is revealed when you look from the ground about the enduring nature of the commons. No doubt about that. And, you know, I'm convinced that we would discover much more of commoning were we to have a kind of global ethnography of place after place. Yet, I'm also struck that the two examples also caution against the temptation to talk up the publics of the poor, commons made in the way that I've described, since many contingencies and situated conditions are in play as to whether co-occupation turns into a commons or not. So I wondered, after I came back from Delhi, I wondered whether the yield of co-occupancy along the Yamuna might be stronger if it had more families and not just single men, if it had a more differentiated social structure, if it had a more mature settlement character like the slum that I looked at, if it had more public and welfare services, and of course, better existential security. I wondered, therefore, whether the analysis of public space, based on the study of ground vernaculars, also and always requires a sense of the wider political economy and biopolitics that shapes the lives of occupants from place to place. Okay, I think I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for your thoughts. And now I would like to hand over to Massimo. Massimo, you have the floor.
Yeah, I think the answers to the question posed by the seminar, especially the first two, how to avoid enclosures and cooptation in general, depends on the ability of social movements and of the commons to be increasingly structurally coupled, develop synergies, articulating strategies and constituting shared horizons. This would require the commons now inhabited in enclaves of urban spaces becoming increasingly articulated into social movements, contrasting enclosures and computation, and building the premises through wider and wider spheres of commoning for the commons right to the city and their surrounding territories. On the other hand, it would also require existing social movements to become increasingly self-aware that their vital role in bringing change through open struggle and contestation must be complemented with the further development of commons-based systems of reproduction. Missing these, their push for social change faced a high risk for cooptation into newly reconfigured state and capital systems, which selectively absorb the energies of these movements for a new round of accumulation, segmentation, and discrimination. At minimum, we would require the substantial democratization of all existing institutions, the redirection of resources to social and ecological needs, and the constitutions of new commons-based institutions and system of social reproduction. This in turn would allow the emergence of alternative ways of being and subjectivity outside of the dominant market logic. The possible good news, I think, is that our pandemic times are showing sign of an acceleration of this process of social recomposition between social movements and common, a trend that began in the midst of neoliberalism with many struggles against enclosures around the world, and the development of new commons practices and narratives. Thus, let me outline some important elements of the context that I think has been developing. I believe we can begin to sense that a period is opening up that the theorists of the science of complexity call the age of chaos, where the existing social order needs to evolve, to reconfigure itself in order to face both internal rigidities on one side and the great perturbation brought about by factors that come from outside the value practices of capital, but which find in modern capitalism a fertile ground. Among these factors, in addition to a virus of zoonotic origin, there is a variety of social origin that has developed mainly since 2008 crisis and is called struggle. In fact, the pandemic lockdown has further aggravated the conditions of crisis that have been dragging on since 2008, if not, one would say, even 1979. And the possibility of global stagnations arises at a time when it is precisely at the global level in the last 10 years that social movements have gained considerable momentum. A recent report by the Center for Strategic and International Studies called the last 10 years the age of mass protest, because street protests in all continents from 2009 to 2019 have gone up by 11.5% on average per year, with peaks of 23.8% per year in sub-Saharan Africa, 17% in North America, and 16.5% in Middle East and North Africa. The report established four main reasons for the struggle. First, the development of global communication and information technologies that have expanded opportunity for organization and communication. Second, the fight against global youth unemployment and underemployment. Three, the increased perception of inequality and corruption. And four, environmental disasters and climate change. The pandemic and the consequent policies of social, better physical distances has initially contributed to push social movements around the world into a sort of an impasse. On May 19, the New York Times, for example, titled an article like this government is lucky, coronavirus quiet global protest movement. In the US, such a pause in large physical mobilization followed a period that saw record levels of in-person protests. Yet apart from the initial impasse, the global pandemic has contributed to the emergence of several persistent points of conflict, continuing the trend of the previous 10 years. Here we find struggles rooted in poverty, inequality, precarization, fight against neoliberal policies, corruption, for the right of seasonal migrants to go back to their villages and access of food during lockdown, as in Ecuador, Chile, Lebanon, India, Kenya, and Iraq, or to demand sanitary material like nurses in Italy, and protest about early return to work in unsafe conditions, like factory workers in Italy and Amazon workers in the US. In different places, other social movements have adapted to the pandemic risk by turning themselves into an organization promoting mutual aid, commoning, as in Algeria, the case of the Iraq movement. In other contexts, the pandemic has pushed protesters to develop new form of protest while maintaining social distances or using vehicle demonstration, as in the case of the Coalition on Homelessness car rally in San Francisco, where drivers blare their horns and signposts on their window demands like hotel rooms, not hospital beds, and test us now, we need to know, or housing is healthcare. But perhaps the most inspiring struggle appeared in time of pandemic is the uprising for life and dignity following George Floyd murder on May 25th, and that is still going on today. The killing of George Floyd, of course, follows a trend of indiscriminate killing by the police in the US, which is the highest in the world, and in which Black people and Native Americans, in particular, suffer a disproportionate share. But in providing context to the uprising following George Floyd killing, we should not underestimate the fact that the pandemic had on highlighting and deepening existing disparities, and thus to entrench the widespread sense of injustice felt by Black communities. The Financial Times reported that during the pandemic, jobs that have been deemed essential and therefore facing the greatest risk saw the preponderance of Black workers, also deep-seated disparity in access to healthcare, high rate of poverty, and cramped living conditions have combined to make the virus especially lethal for people of color. In this context, the murder of yet another Black person by police acted as a match lit on a water-stressed forest. This massive, plural, and variegated uprising following the murder of George Floyd is already having crucial impacts on different fronts and at different scales, from Minneapolis banning the use of chokeholds to police brutality captured on cameras, leading to near immediate suspension and firing of officers in several cities like Buffalo. From the removal of monuments celebrating Confederates in cities in Virginia, Alabama, and other states, putting back to the public debate the question of police defunding and instead funding welfare and social services that address the deep increase in social and economic inequalities accumulated in the last 4 decades of neoliberalism. It also favored renewed debates on the abolition of prison, which can only be pursued through common communities' ideas and practices to address the security and well-being of neighborhoods. The response to the white police repression of the last 2 weeks has also highlighted how commoning and solidarity inside movements is paramount. 3 episodes come to mind. The safe haven provided by various citizens to demonstrators running away from police batons and tear gas, the refusal of bus drivers to transport demonstrators taken prisoners in Boston, and in some areas, the laying down of shields of the National Guard soldiers in solidarity with the demonstrators. A key insight we get when looking at these social movements is that they occur through a bottom-up process that constructs a social force whose purpose is to redesign the values upon which the higher layers of the social structure can govern. It is thus an attempt to reformulate the constraints that these higher layers are legitimized to use upon lower layers. This attempt to refound the values and corresponding selective processes in higher layers of social structure carried out by social movements go hand in hand with the opening up of spaces for common social systems rooted in daily life in lower layers of the social body. On the other hand, the worsening of the economic and social crisis during the pandemic creates an environment that is also conducive to the growth of commoning. As the current pandemic has shown, and then many other disasters in past years, at times when social reproduction suffers a strong shock, new forms of mutual aid and solidarity emerge. As the great environmental disasters such as Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005 and the devastating economic crisis such as in Greece starting from 2009, provided the context from which self-organized solidarity systems were born to deal with the problems highlighted by the emergency, and that neither the state nor the market were able to deal with. Indeed, that both the neoliberal state and the capitalist market contributed to create. The same happens today in the context of the coronavirus, as for example, captured recently by George Monbiot in a succinct review of cases around the world, from young people who send food parcels to daily workers with lost income to volunteer drivers in Wuhan who self-organize to transport doctors and nurses between their home and the hospitals as public transport was suspended, from communities in Johannesburg who produced survival packages containing the necessary coronavirus-era healthcare for township residents, to websites in the US who provided teachers, food, and emergency services for childcare, from the thousands of UK, European, and US mutual aid groups that go shopping for food and medicine for the elderly and other sectors of the population, to Hackfest in Latvia to design the lightest component for a visor that can be produced with a 3D printer, from websites around the world full of shared tips to build masks at home, to tools shared in open source library that bring together technologies and new organizational models. All these and many other cases of mutual aid and commoning shows the emergence of new common languages, values, and correspondent social system. The sudden emergence of peaks of doing in common in phases of crisis is a symptom that society is trying to practice a process of reconfiguration of system and priorities. And it does so, first of all, by creating extra capacity, or in the language again of complexity theory, redundancy, an excess of care and healing capacity compared to what would be given if things were normal, that is, resting on the normality of austerity. It is clear that this redundancy created by doing things in common, sorry, that is my, by doing things together is necessary to face the inadequacy of private and public institutions in the context of decrepit infrastructures, years of underfunded essential services, and local authorities without money. During the next environmental disasters or the next pandemic, I believe we will remember the relational modality that has protected us in this, that is mutual aid and doing in common. The pandemic period has highlighted the fact that many individuals face a dilemma similar to what Gregory Bateson called double bind, a situation in which no matter what a person does, he cannot win. A situation like 20 years old Hussein from Baghdad found himself, has been reported from an article in the Washington Post. He used to earn a little less than $20 a day driving an auto rickshaw in a now shuttered market in Baghdad. He got into a fight with police who tried to fine him for violating Iraq curfew when he went out to seek work. His dilemma is clear when he's reported to have said, "I'd rather die of the virus than die of hunger or see my son or my wife go hungry, but I can't provide with them with food." What should I do? He continued. Beg, steal? The same dilemma can be transposed into so many situations and contexts faced by people around the world, struggling with livelihood issues of different nature. Better to die of coronavirus or to die of racism, better to die of violence or of migration, and so on. Double binds of this type, of course, emerge today in the larger context of neoliberal necropolitics, which by selecting the conditions of social reproduction of life, dictate how some people may live and how some people must die. To get out of this situation, Bateson reminds us, requires creative solutions. But creative solution for individuals often depends on pooling mental and material resources with others and articulate individuals into collectives. The conatus of the self against indignity often forces us to make a distinction, and distinctions, system theorists again remind us, are the act that create new systemic unities out of pluralities. Social movements and the commons are created through the act of such distinction. The escalating global movements and common practices before and during the pandemic are thus posing the issue of social reproduction. This is the terrain in which the potential for multiple structural coupling and alliance building among the many struggles and common practices could favor a radical envisioning and constitution of a social force that pushes toward a new post-capitalist normality. The pandemic has brought out and highlighted what has developed for years now in contrast to capitalist neoliberalism. That is a way of producing that is absolutely necessary for social reproduction, the common at the singular. The common at the singular, to me, embraces both the many commons and their many circuits of collaboration they give rise to, but it also must include social movements and their push to transform the constraints of the higher layers of the social structures upon the lower layers. The capacity of the struggle and the constitutive capacity of doing in common, both outside and inside the circuits of capital and the state, are thus the two fundamental, to me, social processes that constitute a social force of transformation. Thus conceive the common, the singular, not only as a political principle, and not only as a mode of production, but above all, as a mode of production in the making. This making of the common as mode of production occurs in contexts in which at different scales and through different intensities, the circuits of capital and the state also operate on the basis of their own value practices, seeking to appropriate, co-opt, enclose through their control and disciplinary hierarchies. When we speak about the common, therefore, we should never forget these counter forces and their own autopoietic process of adaptation. These two dimensions of the common, the development of their qualities, the ability to spread and coordinate, to create new institutions, generate a force field that intertwines and often collides with the force field of capital. The modality and quality of this collision in the near future will bring about the type of transformation that await us, the new normality. All that remains for us to do is to enter into history. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Massimo, for your presentation. And now I would like to give the floor to Shannon. Thank you.
Okay, great. Can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay, great. I'm sharing my screen now. Can you see my opening slide?
Nope.
I'm trying. Okay. Screen sharing has failed to start. Please try again later. I don't know what that means. Let me try it again. Now can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, very good. So a month ago, when I was invited to take part in this event, the most salient concern for most urbanists was how the city would survive COVID, how all the factors were so fervently romanticized and fetishized about urban life, density, serendipitous encounters, bustling shops, buzzing restaurants, vibrant culture, intermingling smells and textures had suddenly disappeared, become verboten, and in some cases were even reframed as potential liabilities. Would they recover once we weathered the storm? While the neighborhood Thai restaurant and dry cleaners pulled down their metal grates for a long spring hibernation, we then relied on apps and Wi-Fi to connect us to networks of workers who put their own bodies on the line, transforming themselves into a subtractive common resource to bring us drunken noodles and kettlebells and toilet paper. The urban sounds that typically indexed a vibrant public realm had decrescendoed, yet that public registered its recognition of all the frontline workers via a nightly corcellarazo, when everyone leans out into our shared air to sound out to make a joyful noise, a common clamor commemorating common bodies. We also turned reluctantly to a new privately owned pseudo-commons, where we are right now, Zoom. As typically happens with most freely available freely accessible, that is, commercial digital spaces, however, the platform's non-paying users become products themselves, surveilled and subjected to occasionally traumatizing security breaches. Technologists and designers had developed free and open source alternatives, Jitsi for meetings, Unhangout and a platform called Love Chaos Quarantine for events, as well as some free but not totally open spaces for hanging out like Online Town and Animal Crossing. Collectives and communities built mutual aid networks, as Massimo was just telling us about, which linked people through a variety of architectures, including custom designed websites and humble Google Docs to other folks in their urban communities. Designer Paul Solelas has been exploring the communicative and graphic forms that emerged during quarantine to allow for what he calls commoning in crisis. Meanwhile, the infrastructures that enabled that communicative commoning were put to the test. Were our telecommunications infrastructures themselves the source of the virus? And this is a kind of a paranoid map of conspiracy theory connecting 5G to COVID. Could the internet sustain the demand? It seemed to hold up for those of us who had reliable internet access. Meanwhile, glaring iniquities in connectivity, according to some advocates, highlighted the need for new public digital infrastructures and public interest technologies. As a glorious spring sprang, most of us yearn to escape our apartments and homes by taking to our city's common spaces, its parks and sidewalks, typically the only pedestrian-sanctioned and bicycle-friendly physical common spaces in cities built for cars. Those resources proved insufficient to handle the crowds of bodies and bikes. So some cities repurposed automotive zones for people, turning streets into urban commons. How would we ensure that urbanites use those spaces responsibly, maintaining the requisite 6 feet of distance? Well, folks could police themselves, or officials could provide analog nudges like signs or landscape markers. As you can see here, there's a park in Brooklyn where they drew 6-foot circles on the ground to encourage them to self-monitor their behavior in these common spaces. There were, of course, technological solutions too, surveillance cameras and monitoring bracelets and thermal imaging devices. Technology companies were eager to get in on the action by developing contact tracing and social distancing monitoring tools that will conveniently lend themselves to other surveillance applications. These tools would reinforce the surveillance technology's long legacy of racial bias, while the virus itself disproportionately affected people of color, again, as Massimo has just said a little bit earlier. And there was indeed much concern that governments and corporations would seek to extend the lifespan of these tools well after the public health crisis had subsided. Meanwhile, a variety of experts, from medicine to law to information studies, hoped to ensure that public health data constituting a potential information commons itself are used responsibly. Or, rather than policing the urban subject, we could alter her habitat. Architects and designers, meanwhile, were repurposing their own teams and technology to create personal protective equipment for grossly undersupplied hospital workers, or they were converting existing sites, parks and hotels and convention centers into ad hoc medical facilities, or they were designing new flexible structures for care. There's a firm based in Boston, Mass Design Group, that has developed quite an impressive portfolio of relevant work of all of these different genres across the global South in particular. Urban designers, meanwhile, have considered how they might reimagine their own practices for a post-COVID world. A lot of their ideas sound quite familiar. More bikes, more pedestrian zones, fewer cars, more telecommuting that is, more urban farming, in short, more commons, and more smart technologies. The same sensors and cameras that just 6 months ago were pitched to residents as a means of increasing urban efficiency and customization, and to city officials for surveilling and policing purposes, are now rebranded as tools for existential salvation. Yet most planners are merely reasserting the wisdom of old principles, the importance of equitably distributed green spaces and health services and public utilities, the need, as Nicholas de Monchaux declares, for safe, generous, and accessible common space. Common services, too. Design critic Alyssa Walker argues that the pandemic is not fuel for urbanist fantasies. If it's made anything clear, she argues, it's that cities cannot be fixed if we do not insist on dismantling the racial, economic, and environmental inequities that have made the pandemic deadlier. And a second compounding crisis, one that's fomented over the past 3 weeks, complicating and intensifying the pandemic, highlights the consequences of our consistent failures to address those iniquities. The Black Lives Matter movement has revealed both the lie and promise of our urban commons in cities around the world. These protests and petitions and calls for policy change have demonstrated that many of our common urban resources, including especially our security infrastructures, do not serve urban denizens equitably. They've shown how our parks and public streets and public monuments, themselves a sort of knowledge commons, are unequally accessible to different people. And to some folks, those supposed resources, like the police force and Confederate monuments, are more encumbrances or oppressors than amenities. These protests have reminded us that it's so often the same bodies that put themselves on the line, first as a common source of labor to build and maintain and serve our nation and its cities and their residents, and then as a means of reclaiming those city streets as a more just and inclusive commons. The protests have demonstrated that the tools by which streets are monitored and militarized include the same surveillance cameras and geotagged social media posts and data fusion methods that aid in COVID tracking and mitigation. When we add in stingrays and facial recognition software, tear gas and rubber bullets, Amazon Ring doorbells and aerial surveillance drones, we realize that the convergence of racial and information capitalism, as Brian Jefferson has argued in his recent book, transform these city streets into a carceral geography, one that perpetuates the racial injustices described by people like Simone Brown, Ruha Benjamin, Charlton McIlwain, and many other writers. The protests have also highlighted the value of what we might consider new commons, like crowdsourced bail funds, and the revival of oldish commons, like autonomous zones, of which there is one in Seattle right now. They also remind us of the importance of developing community rules for governing common resources, like documentation of the protests themselves, and protecting certain knowledge commons like public libraries. A couple weeks ago, as protests erupted in the South Bronx, I watched rumors spread on the Citizen app and Twitter that looters had set the Bronx Library Center on fire. This is one of the largest, kind of newest, fanciest libraries in the Bronx. The code of conduct seemed to stipulate that a library, what one tweeter calls a place of safety and peace in a community that has historically offered very little of either, was off limits. All the public libraries in New York City have been closed since we entered lockdown in mid-March. And while they've continued to offer digital services, they haven't been able to serve their vital role as a social infrastructure through these difficult months. I've studied public libraries for 20 years. They're among the few public institutions that in which they typically hold trust, and they should be a central component of any vision for urban commons. particularly if we think big and imagine libraries as platforms for the creation of public interest technologies and stewards of community archives and public data. Yet the protests have also shown us that, in addition to tear gas and Twitter, a host of other apparati can serve as commenting tools. A few cans of paint transformed 16th Street in Washington, D.C., just behind the White House, into a public billboard. While I have to note it also did rally the resources of a number of local artists and officials, the project was denounced by the local Black Lives Matter chapter as a performative distraction from the mayor's general inaction on defunding the police. As protesters gathered in increasing numbers around the White House in early June, President Trump erected additional fencing. And by the next day, it had been already reappropriated as a scaffolding for protest art, which volunteers are collecting, and which the Smithsonian Institution now plans to preserve to essentially constitute a part of the knowledge commons. And shortly after the police had taken to confiscating protesters and reporters' bicycles, and after a man in Maryland used his bike to assault a group of teens posting Black Lives Matter's posters, 1,000 bicyclists of all ages commandeered the Manhattan Bridge and the West Side Highway in Manhattan, raising their voices and placards in honor of George Floyd, and in the process, transforming those automotive routes into common pathways. These techniques of appropriation and détournement are, of course, common to protest, but what might allow these examples to yield new lessons here and now is the convergence of contexts, this entanglement of public health and civil rights crises. The creation of and care for urban commons, spaces, infrastructures, technologies, knowledge, labor, and so forth, are central to both struggles. A mix of analog and digital commenting tools characterize both: smartphones and surveillance, personal protective equipment and placards, lungs and voices, bicycles and bodies. And those bodies, those people who built our cities, who care for the sick, who deliver our supplies, who maintain our infrastructures, who raise their voices and fill their lungs, who take the rubber bullets and blink away the tear gas. Many of them have long worked to build common resources from which they've been marginalized or altogether excluded. And to redress these injustices, we might need to attend more closely to ideas about commoning that have long been threaded through other ways of thinking and being, particularly Black feminist and Indigenous thought. Maybe we need to think beyond the individual, beyond the idea of the city and the world and knowledge as an assemblage of resources, and more towards the systemic effects of our actions, toward the realization that, as Arturo Escobar and Marisol de la Caña would say, as we build commons, we're also building political ontologies. Thanks.
Thank you, Shannon, so much for this presentation. And now I will hand over to Richard.
Thank you very much. You're going to show 3 slides of mine. I'll just preface them by saying this. I'm going to show you problems about commoning in 3 cities where the UN is working and struggling to understand ways to relate public space to the activities of commoning. It's kind of a cliche to say that public space is the kind of background for commoning, and the actual spatial form itself is more important than that. So I want to show you 3 ways in which this interaction between the work of commoning and the structure of public space might be understood. If you can show the first slide, wonderful. This is a part of Delhi, not too far away from the spaces, the first space that Amin described to you. It is actually, what you're looking at is a market for mostly for electronic goods, which is actually the top of an underground parking garage, faced on the side by what used to be government offices, which have been abandoned and are now used by tech startup firms. So this is the kind of Silicon Alley of Delhi. And the interest, I think, for commenting in it is not simply that the space has been appropriated for use it was never intended from, but from the fact that there's a mixture here between Hindu and Islamic traders in these electronic goods, mixed in with many more traditional traders in saris, as you can see. And it is a place where most of the goods have, as it were, fallen off the back of a truck. And so people are not paying taxes on them. What's interesting about it, and I'll come back to this at the end of this presentation, is that this is a space in which Hindus and Muslims are mixed without much tension. And the question is how they are able to share a space in common, doing the same kind of activity, without, as in other parts of Delhi, coming into a lot of ethnic conflict. And I think the nature of the space has something to do with that. If you could show the next slide. This is a space in Dharavi, which is embodies another kind of commoning. Dharavi is a slum in Mumbai. And what you can see here are 2- and 3-story buildings. The ground floors of these buildings are used for fairly elementary primary assemblies, like basket weaving, and also for a more complicated kind of primary assembly, which is the cooking of food, which is then distributed by this amazing tiffin network throughout Mumbai for lunch. So this ground plane is a space of production. The spaces above it are where the families of the workers live and where there is a high density of children. I show it to you because due to the pandemic, the coronavirus, something was radically transformed about family commoning here. Before the pandemic, this is a space in which people at work kept an eye on little kids who were in and out of these ground floor shops. And since the lockdown was imposed, the attempt was to keep the children up in the 1st and 2nd stories, away from people on the ground floor. This produced a kind of tension is too mild a word. It produced a kind of angoisse, a kind of suffering, in that people's children were now no longer commoned. The kids before the pandemic would go in and out of any shop. Any adult would be supervising a kid who happened to wander around there. After the lockdown was initiated, the kids disappeared from the ground floor, and the parents became much more mindful of their own children who were constrained above. And it created a kind of tension between families, which before on the ground floor had commoned in doing the work of parenting. We're there, we the United Nations, because we did something very destructive with the World Bank 15 years ago, which you can see in the background, which is we attempted to build workers' housing that was more sanitary, all of that. They actually, those high-rise houses also produces, which were isolated flats, also produced a breakdown in the activity of commoning. But what I'm showing you here is something that illustrates the fact that commoning is not, the most elemental experience poor people have of commoning is dealing with family issues. So this is a space of real crisis now, and the disappearance of commoning due to the pandemic. You could show the next slide, please. This is a space we're working in. It's far behind the Bund in Shanghai. It's another common space, another space of great poverty. And what's interesting about this space is the clothes on the line. This community can only afford one clothes washing machine, and that's about it. They're really poor. We think of Shanghai as this kind of sleek, world-beating city, but it's full of very, very poor people, as well as very rich people. And we're sort of at a ground zero here. This is a shikumen, which is an enclosed courtyard, which is a very old form of dwelling here. What's interesting about this is you see people sharing a clothesline and sharing a washing machine, hanging out while the clothes dry, very easy in the humid climate of Shanghai. But what's interesting about this is that when the lockdown occurred, this sharing continued, even though this now became an empty space. And the people arranged for kind of pickup and delivery of individual clothes. Unlike India, even though they were forcibly locked down by the police, the sort of social tissues of sharing and commoning remained. So that the space is empty, but the activities of commoning go on. So between Mumbai and Shanghai, you have a contrast between a kind of spatial fabric which is very vulnerable to breakdown in social relations, and another kind of spatial fabric, which in a way is not implied in the breakdown as very basic forms of commoning. Now, what I'd like to say at the end of this, if you could go back to the first slide, this one, yeah, is that to me, this is probably the most suggestive slide for us thinking about commoning in much more privileged environments. I and my team have been studying Nehru Place for quite some time, and we're hoping actually to protect it against development, giving it a kind of shield from the UN. What's interesting about this, as I said, it is a space of relatively low conflict between Muslims and Hindus, unlike other parts in India. And the reason for that is that it has two qualities. One is that the space is extremely flexible. Each one of these vendors moves around from week to week, almost day to day, selling their wares. There's no territory in this space in the sense that people in the shikumen feel very territorial about a space, even when they're not in it. The second thing about this is that this is a space of non-verbal commoning. And that's really what I want to stress to you. Here you have strangers being together, sharing a space to a point, to a political point, which is that they are suppressing here tensions which otherwise in the city are verbalized and acted upon violently. They're doing it here by a kind of physical propinquity, which is open, flexible, and indeterminate. And that combination, it seems to me, it's a bodily commoning. That kind of nonverbal, physical commoning in a space which is unfixed seems to me to be one of the reasons that this space works politically as well as economically. And the reason I think it's relevant for us is that a lot of the challenges of commoning we face now are how people can share physical space without territorializing it, or without verbally assigning an identity to it. When we say that this space belongs to whites or this space belongs to blacks, we've already inflicted a wound on that space. It's no longer a space for commoning. The nonverbal and the indeterminate are ways in which we can bring a lot of the public spaces we have back to life. That's true economically as well. The more flexible, the more tactical, as tactical urbanism describes it, we can make spaces, the more I think we are going to create the grounds for some kind of social peace. So that's what I have to say. Okay.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you so much. Thank you all for your brilliant presentations. I think there are some threads connecting your ideas that I would like to address. Maybe now we can just unmute all the panelists so we can engage in a discussion.
Great. No, so I'm unmuted. Okay.
So where to start? There were some really interesting threads, I think, between Shannon and Ash. As you mentioned, the materiality and the aesthetics and the visibility of urban infrastructures and how they affect the spatial experience, the collective formation of knowledge, the being together of the community, as well as the material interexchange of the residents there, by giving the, two examples. One failed, one succeeded. And Shannon, you talked about how the city's infrastructure has been increasingly becoming more digital, more abstract, more intangible, and you mentioned smart technologies, tools of surveillance, the digitalization of public health information, facial recognition technologies, and so on. A question that I have for you, and please, all the speakers are welcome to join in this discussion, is in what ways can we start paying attention, not only to what is visible, but also to what is not visible, to the underlying invisible urban labor conditions that actually construct and sustain the urban commons? And how can we expose the economic, political, and institutional underpinnings of such abstract urban digital infrastructures? Would someone?
Yeah. Okay. I can.
Thank you.
I think the way you put the question, or the contrast between visibility and invisibility, is exactly right. So in just the two examples that I was looking at, what's very interesting is that the visual culture of these two spaces, and I wish I could put up some slides to show them, but I won't try and do that, are very, very different. But in terms of commoning outcomes, I can say pretty safely that in the desolate space of the homeless, one particular kind of visibility, it's the invisibility of the negligence of the state, of the absence of infrastructures, of labor market conditions which rely on these individuals as casual workers once or 5 days a month. It's those things that intervene with a vengeance, if you like, amidst the visibility, all the visibilities of life on the Yamuna Pashta, to undermine it. Okay, so this is not a digital invisibility. It's a biopolitical invisibility with devastating impact. In contrast, in Kusumpur Pahari, which Richard may know, this is a kind of bona fide old 30, 40-year-old neighborhood in which the neighborhood has been constructed by the people themselves, you know, ranging from the organization of the landscape right through to the quality of the build. And so there's almost like a kind of surplus of visibility known to itself and to each other. And it's been co-produced and it's been co-constructed. It's a kind of a historical commons, oddly enough. Most poor neighborhoods, shanty towns, are historical commons, oddly enough.
Yeah.
So this surplus of visibility, in some ways, I think acts to moderate the invisibilities of market and the state. They're kind of kept in check. They're pushed out. Huh? But of course, just to close, when some of the invisibilities become functional, so for instance, under the Kejriwal government in the last 5 years, slums have received an awful lot of infrastructure, from water through to electricity, indeed even surveillance cameras every here and there. That kind of productive invisibility has helped to reinforce the hypervisibility that's producing a kind of people's commons. Okay, so I very much like this, your invitation to try and read the commons around the relationship between the visible and the invisible. But in both cases, for me, apart from mobile telephony, these invisibilities are institutional, infrastructural, and biopolitical.
So I think you asked me to speak. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So I think you asked me to speak specifically to the issue of rendering visible, invisible digital infrastructures in particular. And this is a trope, the rendering visible, the invisible, that has been going around for some time, especially after there was a corrective against moving away from thinking that digital technology's virtual existence was disembodied, disconnected from place, was inherently invisible. So in the past 10 years or so, there have been quite a few kind of public pedagogy projects, art projects that have sought to make visible the invisible, particularly of digital infrastructure. There's also a critique that some of this work is very much rooted in the global north and the presumption that we would have an infrastructure that is fully functioning most of the time, and thus we have the luxury of having it be invisible to us. This whole "you don't know infrastructure is there until it breaks" statement. I also think that focusing solely on the visible maybe allied some of the other embodied ways of knowing that are part of the labor that goes into both digital labor and the physical work of maintaining the physical infrastructures that make digital technologies possible. So I've written a couple pieces about what we can learn by listening to infrastructures, about kind of haptic technologies. There's been some interviews with interesting kind of computer technicians, systems engineers, where they listen to machines or feel vibrations in a different way. So these are additional kind of multi-sensorial ways to make digital processes, digital infrastructures, sensible, S-E-N-S-E-A-B-L-E, and S-E-N-S-I-B-L-E. But also I think that going back to my comment about public pedagogy, I think this is, again, I always go back to libraries. If I think that helping people to be more aware of the infrastructures, labors that make connectivity possible is something that should be part of civics education, which has certainly been deprioritized in much of our public education. And this is maybe a role that public libraries could play. Some of the more progressive libraries have incorporated public programming, even kind of pedagogically oriented art projects that have tried to help people to think more critically about where information comes from, how firewalls work, how algorithms determine search results, etc. So making all of these invisible, kind of both automated and human choices that are made in the background, making them more aware to people in their kind of everyday digital habits or digital behaviors. So those are just a couple of rambling responses to your question.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, this is just an open discussion, so anyone just feel free to jump into. Now it's the most informal part, so everyone just relax and we can.
May I just a short comment on the question of visibility and invisibilities. Of course, our daily life, in our daily routines, in our processes we are involved into always presupposes a particular selection of attention, depending on wherever we are at any given moment. But every object I have right in front of me, as usual, my phone here, you know, and if you think about, we know this, we know because people have been talking about, but we take a phone, we'll see from a shop, is we buy, we use it, we connect with it, but in our daily experience, we abstract from the network of human, social, ecological, and physical connections that any object like this phone connect us to. They, of course, the commodity circuits, the global commodity chains, and how it operates is all presupposed in this, and is invisible in our daily life, like it is invisible in any near or slavery or near slavery conditions of which some of the inputs that goes into this are produced, as it is invisible to our daily functioning operational processes, the environmental pollutions that both the use and the way the overall infrastructure of the digital economy is organized at the moment, and the extraction of raw material, or the domestic labor, much in many cases rooted in patriarchy, behind the workers that reproduce the workers producing this object, or the commoning at the different levels. So I would say that the key, and of course all this we know, I'm not saying anything new, we all know this, but the reason why we know, and the reason why for many of us what is generally invisible, it becomes visible, and it becomes part of our awareness, is through the social movements that around all these issues have been emerging. And that's how we became we became aware of all the implications for that that surround any particular object or any particular sections of the cities. So I think is again the centrality of people organizing and voicing that makes things visible.
Richard, do you have anything to add? Otherwise, I have a specific question for you and Massimo, so as you prefer.
Go, ask me the question.
All right, so I think that both of you, in a way, tackled the issue of the pandemic and how it has influenced common spaces and commoning practices. Massimo, you, in a way, you mentioned that you can see many signs of a growing, let's say, a growing tendency in commoning practices, from mutual aid groups to informal shared healthcare initiatives on a neighborhood level, to open source libraries, to different urban commoning endeavors. And all of those show the inadequacy of public and private institutions. And you also mentioned how bottom-up social movements can fight against police violence, racial inequality, how they struggle for the abolition of the police, to defund the police, etc. And Richard, you mentioned how different sharing practices continued even during the pandemic, how social tissues of community persisted during the pandemic, and in some cases failed, and how there are certain flexible tactical spaces for the commons that have emerged during the pandemic. And also you briefly mentioned the idea of the non-verbal, the bodily, the physical aspect of commoning. So my question, which is a bit general and difficult to address in a sense, is how does the scale and the sustainability of different emergent commoning practices factor in the attempt to fight and get against the grip of the market, against the state, and even against capitalism? In other words, how can we envision more sustained, expanding institutions of the commons?
Well, that's a huge question.
I know, sorry.
So I'll just try and answer one part of it, which is that, to me, there is a real separation between what Heidegger called the life world and the world of social movements. Most of the people, since I've been working at the UN, my overwhelming impression in dealing with poor communities is that people are just struggling to survive. They're trying to make the life world work. We would imagine that sharing and community would be the way to make it work. And that's too simple a material, a calculation of how commoning at this level, which is a basic level of survival, of getting by, works. I think it's a great, in my own view, it's a great error to politicize entirely commoning. It has a political side to it, as Massimo has made very brilliantly clear. But it has another side, which is the side of simply making life work, where there are a different set of vectors that come in. For instance, the act of treating a family as property is something that can be provoked by a threat like the COVID-19 pandemic. That's not a direct line from capitalism to property. It circulates in a different realm of experience. I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that I think it would be a great error to reduce this subject to a set of strategies. Commoning. It's a set of social practices. And some of those practices pose really difficult questions. So I get very uncomfortable about the notion that certainly collective action is part of commoning. But there are lots of other ways of commoning which are much more simpler in a way, more survivalist, and more complicated, because there isn't a connection between capitalism and protection of your family, for instance. That's deductive. So I mean, you've asked a huge question, but my gut reaction is there's something wrong about the question.
Okay. You asked me.
Thank you. I mean, it's a discussion, so I think it's good to, expose our cards and be open. Yes, please.
Yeah, I in a sense, I agree with Richard in the sense that, I mean, if you think about commoning, as Richard said in his intervention before, there is a fundamental aspect of it that we learn and we do in when we grow up in families and inside the immediate spheres of reproduction, which could be families, households of whatever type, but at that level of daily life. And although even there, some of the tools that we will need then later in life are explored, are learned, are unlearned, depending on what age you are at when in moments of life you are at. And they have at different scales and in different dimensions and implications for these other dimensions. So whether it's true that commoning has a dimension which is not immediately recognizable as political in the sense you're referring to, Richard, I think is also the case that we need that extra dimension, that political dimension, which take also inspiration for the many practices of commoning we do within neighborhood, friends, networks, families, etc., which has to do with the reproduction of life, with the emergence of basic values of cooperations that we learn about being with others, and transpose them to a higher scale of social and political action. And the effort I was trying to do here is that these two dimensions, generally we conflate them together, but we don't analyze thoroughly. The relation between social movement and commoning are, to me, precisely those two dimensions. Commoning is essentially about the reproduction of life, through collaboration with others, through the invention of new organizational ways and forms based on values that we co-create with others. But we face an environment there which at a higher scale of social action constrain us, put us in particular situations, in different situations. The world is complex. And you need that moment of political actions, of social movements, precisely to change those constraints and to open up spaces to make, at the lower level, that commoning practice to flourish on different levels. So I think, while I agree with you, I would also try and attempt to maintain these two dimensions in some type of organic synergy in order to promote social transformations, which is sustainable. But of course, every situation has its own peculiarities and specificities. So, so much of abstractions.
Ash, you wanted to,
Yeah, I think Richard has opened up a can of worms here, and helpfully so, I think. So let me start with a kind of a question, really. Why are we so interested in commoning through the life world and commoning through social movements today? And could it be that we are interested because the formal institutionalization of the commons, or the politics of instituting the commons through the state, for instance, has collapsed? Okay, so with the crisis of social democracy, a particular form of capitalism, particular forms of socialist and communalist living. So might it not be the case that now we are kind of almost, and I don't want to do any disservice to this, but we, the world of the life world and the world of social movements has become very prescient and elevated, partly because of the evacuation of some kind of institutional protection of the commons, whether this is the environmental commons or the social and the welfare commons. And so there, I am inclined to agree with Massimo that there's a kind of hand-in-glove relationship between the survival of the life world and the means by which that survival occurs. And I'll just give you a really banal example, but I think it's quite telling. In my Yamuna Pushta homeless bankside, all they have is the life world. And it's a kind of hit and miss life world, and deep solidarities and wonderful forms of support between the individuals. You then have social movements there in place, providing an absolute lifeline. Food comes 2 or 3 times a day, if you can get it. There are temporary shelters for people of a certain age, and so on. So in that situation, the access of the homeless to the means of existence comes through NGOs, which are part of the world of social movements, which are, in a country like India, are absolutely critical. But the context of all of this is the utter evacuation of a generalized politics of welfare provisioning, for an extended citizenry. That seems to me the kind of major dilemma that we find ourselves in the world today, in the global north and in the global south. That automatic means by which people can have equitable access to the means of life is kind of broken, and it's punctured. You could call it an infrastructural crisis. You could call it a state provisioning crisis. You could call it what you like. So I think to repeat, I think there's an important hand-in-glove relationship between, outcomes in the life world and provisions made through other means beyond the life world.
If I could just respond to that, would that be all right?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. Well, I think where we disagree is that I don't look at commoning as an activity of cooperation only. I think I said as a planner that, when I think about an elemental problem that I had in a planner in New York City, which is how to get white and black people to share the same space. Physically, the fear, particularly of white people who normally don't associate with blacks, about being physically close. That to me is a problem of commoning, which has nothing to do with cooperative activity. It has to do with something, I wouldn't say it's more lower. I would never, I think that's also wrong. It's an activity which is much more fundamental, and it deals with the kinds of issues that Foucault wrote about 40 years ago, about the care of the self. How can the care of the self be something which puts you one among many? And the notion that you have to cooperate with somebody else to be able to be one among many, which seems to me the most fundamental way to common, is just wrong. It's not one or the other, but we're so reductive about what we mean by commoning that it's, shared endeavor, it's cooperative interaction, and so on. This is to make this very, very profound notion of being in the midst of other people, to trivialize it and instrumentalize it. So I guess maybe that's also where we have a disagreement about this. As a practical planner, let me just finish. As a practical planner, I would be much happier if I made a space which makes people comfortable in the presence of people whose skins are different, than if I organized a social movement that made demands on a city government. I just think that we have to deal with what commoning is. Commoning is that you are one among many, and that you recognize that. It's not a tactic in that sense. It's that's part of it, but it's much too narrow, in my view.
I don't know.
Perhaps we should open it up to questions from the audience now, so we can have some more voices. So we'll hand over to Michal.
Okay, thank you for all these really thought-provoking discussions. And we have some really great questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to start for a question for you, Shannon. So I'm just reading it, excuse my mispronunciations. Can we develop alternative methods to commoning digital infrastructure and smart city approaches in the long term, even when they are rooted in surveillance capitalism and unequal across marginalized communities? So that was a question from the Zoom chat.
I'm just going to look at it again quickly. So there are multiple definitions of what a smart city is. There's the very kind of corporate surveillance version of it. There's also one that's really rooted in civic technology, of using kind of public data for public good, essentially. And there are a variety of other kind of ways of conceiving of that term too. But if we think about the public good alternative, this already is kind of getting to a partial answer to your question. There is already a discourse, there are already practices of people, the open data initiative that was big, 10 years or so ago. Civic tech, which also had its own kind of pushback over the past few years. Now there's a lot of major funding in public interest technology. There are calls for actually building kind of like a public media stack, where you're essentially building kind of a public version of all layers of the technological stack. So those are just different kind of different points of entry, different kind of points of intervention where you could develop a more public or commons-oriented approach to developing digital infrastructure. There's also, again, looking at kind of more marginalized populations for which these practices are not an alternative, but a necessity, because they're not served by, for example, corporate telecommunications companies. If it's not a lucrative market, a high-speed internet company is not going to want to enter there, in which case you have some cities like Nashville, for instance, building their own municipal their own municipal internet, or you have marginalized communities in New York, in Red Hook, for instance, or the South Bronx, that are actually using mesh networks and building their own community networks. So these are cases where, again, you could have a public alternative at all layers, from the use of data to the building of gadgets to the building of kind of network infrastructures. That said, it still does rely on kind of the same undersea cables. You know, we're not going to go have our neighborhood lay an undersea cable. So it still does come back to some things that are going to have to be corporately or state owned. But those other layers do allow for public intervention.
Thank you. And a question for you, Ash. I'll try and read slower this time. The Zoom chat, it seems like the temporary permanent condition of those dwellings play a part in the extent to which commoning is taking place. Can you speak to the temporality of commoning a bit more, especially in spaces that go through different stages of informality and formalization, which also change their relationship to the state?
Okay, difficult question. Okay, so here are some typical stages in the life of a slum, at least the ones that I know. In the early days of people becoming and being infrastructures, where everything is done by, if you like, an emerging occupation and emerging settlement, there the commoning practices are really quite pronounced, because you have to cooperate, excuse the word, Richard, but at the same time, you also know, you intuit that you are one amongst many. There are a whole series of kind of codependencies, and the space itself is very much in the making. Okay, that's a really critical aspect. What then happens is once the kacha becomes paka, once the housing of plastic and wood turns into brick and such like, and the infrastructure start becoming more and more invisible, it's very odd. There's a moment of, if you like, an increased privatization of life, the increasing instrumentalization of public spaces, and a de-intensification of that public culture of not so much cooperation, but knowing full well that you are in the company of others. Okay, the neighborhood starts becoming more of a neighborhood, more of a collection of houses, and the things that you collectively enjoy recede into the background, both and including your own consciousness. So the third phase then, which I think is a really interesting, let's call it the COVID phase, is you get a shock, you get an attack, you get a disturbance of the status quo and the norm. And I think in that situation, what happens is that things could go in one of two directions. You could get, if there's enough memory around, a return, as it were, to the past, those early days in which having a culture of one amongst many really worked to the benefit of everybody. And so people start at a distance, if you like, pooling together again. Or you get something else going on, which is actually happening in India right now, I think. And that is that the rumors that start circulating, particularly from the state, that these poor neighborhoods are bearers of disease, and the people within them are also bearers of disease, Muslims in particular. That's the script that we're hearing at the moment. What that is beginning to produce in some informal or settled informal settlements is a politics of fear and suspicion. Okay, so there, if you like, the public culture of COVID is producing a culture of intense fear amongst neighbors, on religious lines, on class lines, on all sorts of lines. And I rather fear that the balance between this desire to return to the early days of living in each other's company is kind of giving way to playing, if you like, by the rule book set by a very bellicose, divisive government in India.
Thank you. So we are kind of running slowly out of time. So I will now read one question referring to Richard and one to Massimo from the chat and the YouTube. And I already asked audience members who would like to audiovisually join us and ask their questions in a more personal manner to raise their hand already. So Alex can identify you and we can get to everyone as quickly as possible. Massimo, what do you see as the place of the global attention and contribution to creating and developing what are fundamentally commons issues? Is there a problem with accesses of care being input by those disconnected from the actual community structure in each place? I think that kind of feeds to discussions we were already having. And very quickly, another question for Richard. So can we create or transmit indeterminate spaces out of previously territorialized spaces? And how can we publicly readdress previous forms of exclusion, injustice, exploitation through intermediate spaces? So if you can both respond as briefly as possible, and we'll get more questions. Thank you.
Okay, shall I start?
Yeah.
I'm not sure whether I completely understand the question, but I just take the second part, which I may understand better. Is there a problem with excess of care being an input to those disconnected from the actual community structure? I suppose it depends on the context. I'm not sure whether we can generalize something like this. There are some cases in which the mutual aid networks that have been developing are part of the communities or the broader communities which were helped by this network, and others who didn't. But through those encounters, relations that have developed, are developed, potentially developed, and therefore the community itself extend. You know, the sense of what could be a community could extend. So, but of course, all this depends on the particular situations, the particular context in which they are located and performed. This is also to say, to relate to something said before, that commoning here is definitely not a tactic, or it's definitely not only a tactic. I disagree with this reductionism to of what commoning is to a tactic as well. Commoning is far more complex. Commoning, I mean, the way I see it is commoning is a dance of life. It's fundamental because it's a dance of life. Everything emerged out of the ongoing interactions for social reproduction, for human reproduction. And out of that social interactions, which often is material and as well immaterial, cultural, and all the different dimensions of a complex social life. Out of these, there emerge values and cultures and all other questions. So I'm not sure that I would respond to that. I would agree with the fact that somehow it is implicated in what I said, that commoning is reduced to tactics at all. On the other hand, though, it is important to reflect on tactics and strategies, but the reflection is not the answer to those reflections. Is not something generalized. It's something, again, situated, like this question prompted me to say, it's situated in particular scales of social actions. And when I refer to higher or lower, it's not a value. I'm using, again, complexity theory understanding of holonic structures in which the hierarchy is not a control hierarchy, it's like the one of the state or corporations or whatever, but it's spheres of action. So the lowers actually give the condition to the higher spheres, which overall coordinate larger areas of life. So this is something we can, I don't think we have time to, but I just wanted to spell out this. Commoning involves all the dimensions of life, okay? And in whatever situations we are discussing, we of course select out what is important in that particular moment. But it's definitely, commoning is definitely not reducible to a tactic, a strategy. It is what it is. It's our being in the world, and therefore learning the care of the self, as been said by Richard, understanding to be one of the many. But that understanding of being one of the many comes out of and is continuously renegotiated in the activity of commoning with others. So that's all I want to say. Really.
Thank you. We're out of time. We might move to Richard quickly, and then we might manage to do a few questions from the audience. Thank you very much.
Well, this is a very good question about, and it's a kind of holy grail of planning now, how to informalize formally very rigid and formalized structures. The particular tactic that I'm interested in is how to work on the edges of public space so that they're much more porous and that the edges become much more ill-defined. But there are ways to informalize. With Ash's student, Pablo Sendra, and we've just published a book called Designing Disorder, very cheap on Verso, which tries to look at some of these ways of informalizing overly defined environments.
Thank you. And I will now move to Alex to take some questions from people who are raising their hands.